There are moments when silence is no longer holy, when the whispering of shadows becomes too loud to ignore. There comes a time when you must not beg the darkness to leave, you must command it. My brothers and sisters, there is a rhythm to power, silent, ancient, unseen. Some build altars not of stone, but of envy, of ill will, of whispered curses. They do not always speak, but their intentions echo in unseen chambers. And for too long, too many have stood at the edge of their own destiny, trembling before shadows that have no rightful claim. For too long, hearts have bent under invisible chains. But hear me well today. What is bound in the light cannot be broken in the dark. There are battles that roar like thunder, where the world can point a finger and say, "There, that is the fight." But then there are the other kinds, the quiet wars, the subtle storms, the invisible struggles that unfold not on public stages, but in the unseen corners of our lives. These are not the clashes of armies or the shouts of crowds. These are the wars that tremble beneath conversations, that hum beneath laughter, that hide behind handshakes and borrowed smiles. They are the conflicts that live in the pause between words, in the tightening of a jaw, in the glance that lingers a moment too long. So many live their days unaware that the air around them hums with quiet intent, that not every silence is peaceful, not every embrace is pure, not every presence is harmless. To recognize the invisible battles is to awaken your inner sight, to understand that what you cannot see may still shape the ground beneath your feet. The unseen has a language of its own. It is not written in ink or carved into stone, but it speaks through patterns, through feelings that arrive uninvited, through atmospheres that change without reason. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight press against your chest, though no word was spoken? Have you ever smiled at someone and felt an invisible chill slide down your spine, as though their eyes carried a secret message meant only for the shadows? These are not coincidences, they are signals. They are reminders that human interactions extend far beyond the reach of visible gestures. Energy moves, intent travels, and sometimes battles are fought through currents you can feel but not touch. The first step toward victory in any spiritual confrontation is not swinging wildly in the dark, but knowing, truly knowing, that the dark may already be watching. Consider the story of a woman who worked each day among colleagues she called friends. She shared laughter in the hallways, coffee in the morning, dreams over lunch. Yet each night, as she returned home, an unexplainable heaviness settled in her bones. She began to wake with a weight pressing on her chest, as though she had carried something invisible from those bright office walls into her quiet home. One evening, as the sun folded into the horizon, she sat in stillness and listened, not to music, not to words, but to the air itself. She realized that certain faces smiled while their hearts whispered otherwise. She recognized that the heaviness she carried was not born within her, but attached to her through silent envy and unspoken ill will. Her awakening did not happen with fanfare. It happened in silence, in that sacred moment of recognition. She did not need proof written on paper. Her spirit was the witness. Invisible battles often wear familiar faces. They do not always arrive cloaked in mystery or dressed in black robes. Sometimes they come with warm greetings, generous gestures, and voices that echo kindness while carrying a quiet blade beneath. And because they wear the mask of the ordinary, people overlook them, dismiss them, rationalize the discomfort. They tell themselves it's nothing, that it's just their imagination. But the spirit is rarely wrong. When something in your soul whispers, "Pay attention," it is not paranoia, it is perception. To recognize invisible battles is to honor that whisper, to refuse to let logic silence intuition, to understand that not all wars announce themselves with trumpets. The unseen battlefield stretches across families, friendships, workplaces, even sacred spaces. In families, jealousies buried under generations can hum beneath Sunday dinners. In friendships, silent rivalries can nestle behind compliments. In workplaces, ambition can morph into quiet sabotage. The invisible is not limited by location. It flows wherever the human heart beats. Imagine a candle in a still room. If someone opens a hidden door, even slightly, the flame wavers. You may not see the door open, but you will see the effect on the light. That is how invisible battles operate. You may not witness their hand, but their impact is undeniable. The flicker of your peace, the sudden heaviness, the strange fatigue, the uneasy quiet, these are the candle's warning. In many cultures, stories of invisible struggles are told not to breed fear, but to sharpen awareness. Elders speak of eyes that look but do not see, of words that seem harmless but are tied with strings, of places where shadows gather though the lights are on. A traveler in a distant village once recounted how he felt no threat as he passed through crowded streets, but in one narrow alley where no one stood and no sound stirred, his skin prickled as though surrounded. The villagers later told him that alley was avoided, not because of what was there, but because of what was not seen. He laughed at first, calling it superstition. But weeks later, he returned, wiser, and admitted that though his eyes had seen nothing, his spirit had not lied. The act of recognizing these invisible battles is not about superstition or fear. It is about acknowledging that the physical world is only one layer of existence. Just as the wind can shape the desert without ever being seen, unseen forces can shape the trajectory of a life. People often spend their strength fighting the visible symptoms while ignoring the roots buried in silence. They patch cracks in the wall while the foundation shifts beneath them. Recognition is the lantern that reveals where the real work must begin. It is the pause before the strategy, the moment when you open your eyes not to what is presented, but to what is present. Salt has walked with humanity since the first dawn cracked open the sky, before kingdoms were born and maps were drawn, before temples rose and cities glittered. Salt was already here, resting in the folds of the earth and sleeping in the arms of the sea. It is more than a seasoning sprinkled over meals. It is a witness to generations, a keeper of secrets, a quiet guardian of purity. Civilizations have followed salt trails the way rivers follow gravity. It has been traded like gold, protected like treasure, and honored like a sacred companion. It is the one element that can lie still in your hand and yet speak of oceans, deserts, tears, and life itself. Salt does not demand attention, but it has shaped empires, preserved harvests, healed wounds, and sanctified rituals. When you hold a handful of salt, you are holding something older than memory, something that has seen both the rise and the fall of powers far greater than your own. Throughout history, salt has stood as a universal symbol of purification and preservation. Ancient healers used it to cleanse wounds because they understood that salt draws out impurity. Priests in temples scattered it along thresholds to mark the passage between the profane and the sacred. Sailors cast it over their shoulders to appease the restless waters. In quiet villages, mothers would place bowls of salt in corners of their homes, believing it absorbed what could not be spoken. It became the silent sentinel in spaces where words were not enough. Its grains, though small, carry an immense spiritual gravity. When salt is scattered, it does not float like ash. It lands with weight, embedding itself into surfaces as if declaring, "Here, nothing unclean will linger." There is something striking about the way salt interacts with what it touches. It does not disguise or decorate. It draws out, place it on meat, and it pulls out moisture to preserve it for years. Drop it in water, and it dissolves, altering the nature of the liquid itself. Sprinkle it on a wound, and it burns not to harm but to heal. Salt tells the truth. It does not pretend. Where there is decay, it reveals. Where there is stagnation, it stirs. Where there is impurity, it confronts. That is why, in so many cultures, rituals of spiritual protection begin with salt. It is not a weapon in the usual sense. It is a revealer, a cleanser, a stabilizer. When darkness hides in corners, salt moves quietly into those spaces and draws it out like a magnet pulling iron from sand. In one coastal village, an elder woman was known for never locking her door at night. When asked why, she would smile and point to the thick line of coarse sea salt spread across the threshold. She had no guards, no gates, no alarms, but she had salt. She believed that nothing ill-intentioned could cross a line marked by purity, because impurity cannot stand where truth resides. Many laughed at her simple faith, Yet her home remained untouched through storms, through raids, through strange nights when others reported uneasy happenings. One evening, a traveler knocked, curious about her ways. She invited him in, offered him food, and told him stories. Salt listens, she said softly. It hears the steps before they reach the door. Her use of salt was not just superstition, it was a physical proclamation of invisible order. The salt did not fight, it simply stood as a line the darkness dared not cross. Salt has always carried a dual identity, both earthly and spiritual. On the one hand, it is part of the ground beneath your feet. On the other, it belongs to the domain of the sacred. When you hold it, you hold both the soil and the soul. It is gathered from the sea and dried by the sun, merging water and fire, earth and light. It carries the memory of oceans, yet becomes solid enough to be held. In rituals across continents, salt is used to seal intentions. Circles of salt mark sacred spaces, drawing a boundary between what belongs and what must stay out. In marriages, some cultures exchange salt instead of vows, symbolizing a bond that, like salt, will preserve through time. In funerals, it is sprinkled to cleanse the path between the living and the departed. Salt enters every chapter of human existence quietly, but its presence is never insignificant. Imagine a person standing at the threshold of their home, a small bowl of salt in their hands. They are not shouting, not waving charms, not summoning storms. They are simply scattering salt at their doorway. The act seems humble, almost too simple to matter. But spiritually, that person is drawing a line that says, here, truth begins. Here, corruption finds no welcome. Here, light has a home. It is a silent yet powerful stance, not of aggression, but of unwavering clarity. Just as a lighthouse stands firm against the crashing waves, salt sits in corners, on thresholds, in hands, quietly doing the work of warding, revealing, and protecting. Salt's power is also deeply personal. Just as it preserves food from decay, it can preserve the heart from bitterness when used with intention. Some wash their hands with salted water to symbolically wash away negativity. Others sprinkle it around spaces where heavy conversations have occurred, not to erase the words, but to cleanse the residue they leave behind. In one family, after every heated argument, the grandmother would boil water, stir in salt, and slowly walk through each room, murmuring words too soft to catch. By the time she finished, the house would feel lighter, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. She never explained her ritual, but those who lived there noticed its quiet power. It was not performance, it was practice. Black thread is more than a strand of fabric twisted into a line. It is a symbol, a quiet yet firm declaration, a spiritual boundary drawn with hands that understand the language of unseen things. In many cultures across deserts and mountains, across temples and villages, black thread has been tied not for decoration but for defense, not for fashion but for focus. It is plain, unadorned, and humble to the eye, yet it carries with it a gravity that gold cannot mimic. Unlike bright colors that announce themselves, black absorbs, it conceals, it holds. It stands as a silent witness, a reminder that not every act of power must be loud, and not every shield must glitter to protect. When a person ties black thread, they are not merely wrapping fiber around their wrist or an object. They are binding intention, anchoring spiritual resolve into something tangible that can travel with them. The choice of black is not accidental. Black has long been misunderstood by many as a symbol only of sorrow or shadow, but in spiritual practice, black is the absorber. It is the shade that drinks in stray energies, that draws in what others release, that guards without demanding to be noticed. While white reflects and radiates, black receives and holds. In ancient traditions, healers and elders understood this subtle language of color. They knew that when protection was needed, black thread would not merely hang like ornament, it would act like a net, catching the silent darts of ill intent before they could pierce the heart. The thread does not create power on its own. It channels the wearer's intention, becoming a focused vessel for resistance against forces that cannot be fought with hands. There are families who, for generations, have tied black thread around the wrists of newborn babies, not because the thread itself is magical, but because it represents a barrier between the vulnerable soul and the wandering gaze of envy. A mother in a small rural town once wrapped a thin black thread around her child's tiny wrist. whispering a quiet prayer as she tied the knot. She did not make a spectacle of it. She simply moved with the certainty that this act placed a wall between her child and the unspoken harm that sometimes lingers in curious eyes. Strangers would comment on the child's beauty, some with kindness, some with unfiltered jealousy, and yet the child remained protected, as if the thread served as a quiet sentinel, absorbing what was not meant to reach that innocent soul. The thread, soaked in intention, became an extension of the mother's vigilance. In another place, far from rural simplicity, a young man in a bustling city tied black thread around his wrist, not as a family custom but as a personal act of reclaiming his spiritual strength. He had faced betrayal in friendships that wore warm smiles but hid cold hearts. He had felt unseen eyes linger on his successes, not with joy but with hunger. One evening, under the weight of energies he could not name but could deeply feel, he sat alone, holding a spool of black thread. With each wrap around his wrist, he silently spoke his boundaries, naming what he would no longer allow to pierce him. It was not the thread alone that shielded him. It was the act of tying, the declaration of spiritual authority woven into each knot. Days later, he noticed the heaviness lift, not because the world changed, but because he began to walk with the awareness that unseen forces were being met by an unseen guard. The black thread has also served as a reminder for those who wear it. It is easy to forget the invisible battles when the world keeps you busy with visible ones. But a thread, light as air, brushing against your skin with every movement, keeps your awareness sharpened. It is a whisper on your wrist that says, "Remember your ground. Remember your strength." In many spiritual circles, practitioners tie the thread while reciting prayers, blessings, or intentions, weaving their inner words into the outer world. Each knot becomes a sealed chamber of resolve, each twist a pathway for energy to flow. The thread does not need to be thick or ornate. Its strength lies in what is spoken into it and what it silently carries thereafter. There are also rituals where black thread is tied not around people, but around objects or spaces. In old homes where whispers of unrest were felt, black thread was tied around salt, around the legs of sacred furniture, around door handles, around the neck of jars filled with herbs. Elders believed the thread acted like a seal, binding the purifying elements to their purpose. A widow once tied black thread around the gate of her home after a season of unexplained misfortunes. She did not shout at the sky or curse the winds. She simply tied the thread knot by knot, whispering words only she and the night could hear. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the unease lifted. Visitors later said her house felt different, though no one could name exactly why. She would just smile faintly, her fingers resting on the tied knots as if greeting old friends. The black thread's strength lies in its quietness. It does not flash like metal charms, does not clang like bells. It rests, absorbs, holds, guards. In a world that often mistakes noise for power, the thread is a reminder that some of the greatest defenses are the ones no one sees. It is a tether between the seen and the unseen, a visible sign of invisible awareness. Its knots are like signatures written not on paper but on air, marking boundaries that darkness can feel even if it cannot read. Fire has always been both feared and revered. It is the element that warms homes and destroys cities, the force that lights the darkness and consumes the old. To burn something intentionally is not merely to set it aflame. It is to enter a conversation with transformation itself. When flame meets matter, something shifts. What was solid becomes smoke. What was bound becomes free. What was hidden becomes revealed. The act of burning is not just about destruction. It is about release. It is the moment when what could not be spoken is carried upward in curls of smoke, when silent burdens are handed over to the purging heat of fire. Across cultures and centuries, people have gathered around flames, not only for light, but for clarity, for power, for the sacred moment when human intention meets the primal force of the world. The ritual of burning has been woven into spiritual practice since the earliest flickers of civilization. In temples, incense was burned to carry prayers upward, as though the smoke itself were a messenger. In villages, herbs and offerings were thrown into fires to cleanse the air of malevolent energies. Warriors would burn garments of fallen enemies, not for cruelty, but to end the influence of the past upon the present. The flame was not just a tool, it was a threshold. When you set something aflame, you acknowledge that it will never return in the same form. The ashes may remain, but the essence travels elsewhere. Burning is final, it is decisive. It is a way of saying, "This no longer holds me." In the act of burning Tide salt wrapped in black thread, the gesture carries layers of meaning. The salt has absorbed, the thread has bound, but the flame transforms. When the match is struck and the fire begins to lick the salt-bound bundle, you are no longer simply holding objects, you are holding the story of everything that has touched those elements. The crackle of the fire is not just sound, it is testimony. The smoke rises like a silent witness, carrying with it the unseen weight that the salt has drawn in and the thread has held. There is a solemnity to it, like the quiet of a courtroom when truth is finally spoken aloud. Watching something burn is to watch the invisible become visible, if only for a moment, before disappearing into air. Consider a woman who lived in a house where unease had settled like dust. Each night, shadows of fear crawled through her mind, though nothing visible threatened her. She had tried prayers, music, conversation, but something unseen remained. One evening, guided by the wisdom of her grandmother, she tied black thread around a handful of coarse salt, whispered her intentions over it, and set it aflame in a metal bowl. As the fire caught, the salt cracked like a whip, the thread curled into blackened lines, and the smoke coiled upward with purpose. She did not shout incantations or perform theatrical gestures. She simply watched. With each spark, she imagined the unseen burdens unraveling. The room felt as if it exhaled. The heaviness that had once seemed immovable began to dissolve, not because of spectacle, but because she had participated in a sacred exchange. She offered the weight to the fire, and the fire answered. The act of burning is also deeply psychological. Fire is definitive. It leaves no doubt that something has changed. If you bury something, it can be dug up. If you lock it away, it can be found. But if you burn it, its physical form ceases to exist. This is why people across ages have burned letters they never sent, journals filled with pain, objects tied to memories they could not bear to hold anymore. Watching something burn gives the human heart closure, not because the object itself holds power, but because the mind recognizes transformation when it sees it. The curling smoke and collapsing structure become mirrors to our inner letting go. Flame turns the intangible into a tangible process of release. In one small town, after years of quiet tensions between two families, the matriarchs decided to end the silent feud. They gathered symbolic items, a lock of thread, a pinch of salt, and 2 branches from their ancestral trees. In the presence of witnesses, they bound the items together and set them on fire. As the bundle burned, the air grew still. Everyone watched the smoke rise, and though no words were exchanged in that moment, something shifted between the families. The burning was not just a ritual, it was a shared acknowledgement of the weight they were willing to let go. In the weeks that followed, conversations softened, doors opened, and laughter returned to spaces where silence once lived. Fire demands presence. You cannot light something and walk away without consequence. To burn is to be present as transformation unfolds. It requires both courage and surrender, to hold the match steady, to let the flame consume, to resist the urge to rescue what is meant to be released. This is why rituals involving fire often take place in silence or prayerful stillness. The fire does the speaking. It does not require human language to declare its verdict. The crackle, the glow, the smoke are its eloquent tongue. Those who participate are not merely spectators. They are witnesses to their own power being enacted in a physical world. Burning also bridges the human and the elemental. It is one of the few acts that engages all senses at once. The sight of flame, the sound of crackle, the scent of smoke, the heat against the skin, the shift in air. It creates a moment where you are fully aware, pulled out of distraction and placed squarely in the now. When you burn what was once heavy, you are not simply destroying, You are participating in a timeless ritual of release, aligning yourself with the same force that has turned night into light since the beginning of time. There are altars that are built in the light, altars of love, reverence, and truth. And then there are altars that are erected in silence, in corners where envy festers and ill intention gathers like dust in forgotten rooms. These are not altars of stone and gold, though sometimes they wear disguises that seem holy. No, false altars are often invisible to the eye but heavy in the spirit. They are constructed with whispered curses, with jealousy hidden behind polite smiles, with resentments that were never healed but instead laid brick by brick in the unseen. People build these altars not with hammers but with thoughts, with repeated intentions that bend the air around others. A false altar can exist in a neighbor's bitterness, in a friend's hidden rivalry, in a relative's quiet resentment. It can exist in spaces where truth is twisted into performance, where sacredness is mimicked but not lived. False altars are deceptive because they often blend into the background of daily life. They do not announce themselves with thunder or lightning. They stand quietly, sustained by the energy of those who feed them unknowingly. Imagine a house where laughter fills the air, but unease lingers like a scent that refuses to fade. Visitors come and go, conversations happen, meals are shared, yet something unseen hums beneath it all. That hum is often the sound of a false altar, built not by visible hands, but by consistent silent intentions aimed at control, envy, or harm. These altars are erected in hearts where love has been replaced by possessiveness, in minds where comparison has overtaken gratitude. And because they are not visible, people continue to interact as if nothing is wrong, while something heavy grows behind the scenes. Throughout history, spiritual traditions have spoken of the fall of idols and the crumbling of false powers. The idea is not just metaphorical, it is deeply experiential. When light is introduced into a space that has long been ruled by shadows, structures built on lies cannot withstand it. A false altar depends on secrecy, on the belief that no one sees. But when someone awakens, when they begin to act with clarity, when they bring salt to purify, thread to bind, fire to transform, the false altar is exposed. Its strength has always been borrowed from the ignorance or fear of those it tries to influence. The moment that fear dissolves, the altar begins to shake. Like a tower built on sand, it has no foundation to withstand the force of truth. In one village, there was a family plagued by strange misfortunes. Their crops failed, their animals grew sick, arguments erupted without cause, and an oppressive heaviness settled over their home. After many failed attempts to solve the issues in practical ways, the eldest woman of the household, wise with age and silent observation, declared that there was a false altar somewhere tied to their family's name. She gathered the family one evening and led them to an old corner of the property, beneath a tree that no one had touched for years. There, hidden beneath stones and withered leaves, they found small objects wrapped in cloth, tied with unfamiliar knots and arranged in a deliberate pattern. It was not a shrine of devotion, but one of envy, placed there by someone who wished to see their downfall. With calm precision, she untied the knots, sprinkled salt, bound it with black thread, and burned it. As the fire consumed the remnants, a strong wind blew through, scattering ashes into the night. From that day, the strange heaviness lifted, as though something that had held the house in an invisible grip had lost its power. False altars are not always physical, though. Many exist within people's emotional landscapes. A woman once realized that she had unknowingly allowed someone's opinion to become a kind of altar in her mind. Every decision she made circled back to their judgment. Every success was shadowed by their envy. She carried their silent disapproval like a weight, until one day, through quiet reflection and ritual, she recognized that she had been bowing to a false altar built not in the world but within her own thoughts. She gathered symbols of their influence, a letter, a photograph, a piece of jewelry once given in malice disguised as kindness. She wrapped them, tied them, salted them, and set them aflame in the night. The act was not about destroying objects, but about collapsing a structure that had lived rent-free in her spirit. The smoke rose, and with it, her sense of liberation grew. The altar within her mind had finally fallen. False altars persist because they are sustained by energy, fear, obsession, attention. When a person begins to withdraw their energy, to reclaim their space, the altar loses its fuel. It is like a fire that, when starved of air, cannot keep burning. Spiritual acts, such as tying black thread, burning salted bundles, or cleansing spaces with intention, are not empty gestures. They are ways of shifting energy, of declaring that the unseen no longer has silent dominion. When the foundation of false altars is shaken, they crumble not with grand explosions, but often with quiet collapses, like walls that give way in silence after years of being hollow. The collapse is not always visible to outsiders, but those who have lived under its shadow feel it deeply. The air changes, the heaviness lifts, the space breathes differently. There was once a merchant who envied his younger brother's prosperity. Outwardly, he congratulated him. Inwardly, he resented every step of his rise. Over time, his envy took the form of quiet, repeated ill wishes spoken into the night, offerings laid not in reverence but in bitterness. He built unknowingly a false altar of his own making. But when his brother, sensing unease, performed a simple ritual with salt and fire, something shifted. The merchant's altar, built on jealousy, began to unravel. His own life started to feel the weight of what he had constructed. He fell ill, his business faltered, and he eventually confessed his deeds, realizing that the altar he had built to curse another had ensnared him as well. False altars are treacherous in that way. They consume not only their targets but their builders, for anything rooted in darkness must eventually feed on its own source. False altars cannot endure under the steady gaze of truth. They depend on being ignored, on existing in the margins where no one pays attention. But the moment light is directed toward them, through awareness, ritual, intention, they tremble. They collapse not because of violence, but because they were never real to begin with. They were constructions of fear, envy, and secrecy, and when those elements are withdrawn, their walls dissolve like mist at sunrise. There comes a moment in every person's journey when they must stop looking outward for deliverance and start standing in the quiet, unshakable center of their own power. Spiritual authority is not borrowed, not gifted by another human, not bestowed through titles or rituals alone. It is claimed. It rises from within like a flame long buried under ash, waiting for the breath of courage to awaken it. To stand in spiritual authority is to recognize that your voice carries weight in unseen realms, that your presence can shift atmospheres, that you are not a passive spectator in the spiritual fabric of your life. Many spend years running from shadow to shadow, seeking external answers, forgetting that the most potent command often comes from their own lips, the firm declaration whispered in solitude that reverberates through invisible spaces. Spiritual authority is not loudness, it is steadiness. It is the difference between a storm that thrashes and a mountain that simply stands. Some think authority comes from shouting prayers or waving symbols, but true authority is not measured in volume or performance. It is measured in certainty. A person who knows their ground does not need to raise their voice for the unseen to listen. Just as a lion does not need to announce itself in the jungle, one who walks in spiritual authority does not beg darkness to retreat. They speak, and it obeys because their words are rooted in alignment with something greater than fear. This kind of power is quiet but unmistakable, like the still air before a great wind, carrying weight that cannot be faked. Consider a woman who had spent years feeling as though her home was under a cloud she could not explain. Every night, strange sounds echoed through the halls. Tensions arose between family members without reason, and an oppressive mood hung over the rooms like heavy curtains. For a long time, she called others to cleanse the space, bringing in people with rituals and chants, relying on their strength while doubting her own. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, she sat alone and realized that she had been living as though she were a guest in her own home. Her heart steadied. She rose, lit a simple candle, and walked through each room, speaking aloud, not in anger but with authority, declaring that nothing not born of light had permission to remain. Her voice did not tremble, she did not plead, she stated. And in that act, something shifted. The air changed, the heaviness lifted, not because of any grand external ritual, but because she finally stood in the center of her own spiritual authority. This authority is not the absence of fear, it is the refusal to be ruled by it. Many imagine that spiritual strength belongs only to those without doubt, but in truth, authority is often born in the trembling moments when a person chooses to stand anyway. It is forged in the silence of long nights when whispers of doubt press against the heart and the soul decides to speak back. It is grown in the spaces where no one is watching, where you confront the invisible and refuse to bow. A young man once confided that he felt as though unseen forces mocked him, playing on his insecurities. He wore protective charms, followed rituals, but deep down, he carried the belief that he was powerless. One night, in frustration, he tore off the charms, stood barefoot on the floor, lifted his head, and declared with a voice he didn't know he had, "This is my space. I belong here. No shadow commands me." The room did not shake, there was no dramatic thunder, but inside him a line was drawn. From that moment forward, his posture changed, and with it, the energy around him did too. Spiritual authority also means recognizing that you do not stand alone. Authority is not arrogance, it is alignment. Just as a branch carries the power of the tree when it remains connected, a person carries authority when they stand in harmony with the divine, however they understand it. Elders in many traditions have taught that when you speak from a place of truth and light, the universe itself leans in to support your words. A traveler once told a story of walking through a forest at dusk, feeling a growing sense of dread as darkness fell. Instead of running or cowering, he stopped, closed his eyes, and spoke softly but firmly. "I walk in the protection of the light. Nothing in this place will touch me without my consent." He then walked on, not hurried, not fearful, and the oppressive sensation that had been gathering around him dissipated like mist. He did not shout into the woods. He stood in quiet authority, and the woods responded. Authority manifests differently for everyone. For some, it is in the unwavering way they pray. For others, in the way they hold silence like a blade. For some, it is the ritual of burning, salting, or tying threads. For others, it is the way they simply stand, shoulders back, gaze steady, voice clear, declaring their boundary in both the seen and unseen. There are people who carry no visible symbols of faith or protection, and yet when they enter a space, the air seems to respect them. They do not command through fear. They embody a presence that darkness instinctively recognizes as immovable. This is the essence of spiritual authority. To be a pillar that does not sway with every whisper of shadow, to know so deeply who you are and what belongs to you that anything that seeks to disrupt must reckon with that certainty. A family once faced a series of inexplicable disturbances that left them feeling fragile and hunted by something they couldn't name. They called religious leaders, spiritual healers, even skeptics, but nothing shifted. One night, the father gathered his family in their living room. He did not bring holy water, incense, or charms. He brought only his voice. He spoke slowly, deliberately, declaring that their home was a place of peace, that no ill will had authority there, and that his family stood under the protection of something greater than fear. As he spoke, his children's trembling subsided. His wife's breathing steadied. The atmosphere changed, not through spectacle, but through the presence of authority. His words carried the weight of someone who had stopped running from shadows and turned to face them. Spiritual authority is the inheritance of every soul willing to claim it. It is not granted by ritual objects, though they may support it. It is not dependent on others, though they may witness it. It is the quiet strength that rises when a person understands they are not at the mercy of unseen forces, but stand as a co-creator within the fabric of the world, able to speak, to command, to draw lines, to hold ground. When you stand in that authority, the unseen does not just hear you, it recognizes you.